fireside chat here with our Alex from compliance, going to focus on compliance, and he is from Mosey, and Mark, who is from Sequoia One, and will be really focused on PO, and myself, the facilitator, Jonathan Goldsmith, and I am from Remote and focus on payroll. Alex, Mark, lovely to have you here. Alex, can you briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your expertise in the Mosey and compliance area?
Sure. Yeah. And also, first of all, thank you for having me, and also everybody for attending. Really excited to be here. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. Mosey was started to help make the whole state and local compliance in the US really easy. Part of the reason why I started Mosey to begin with was how much experience I had when helping founders from all over the world start a US company. The last product that I led was at Stripe called Stripe Atlas. Some of you maybe have even used it before, but there's over 50,000 founders from all over the world that have incorporated in there. And that also gave me a firsthand look into all of the challenges they have as they're entering the US, getting employees on payroll, dealing with taxes. And so now with Mosey, trying to make that process really easy, we work with companies that are probably a little bit larger, who are scaling and have a lot more complication with that. But that's what we're here to do.
That's amazing, Alex, and to be able to give a helping hand to all these companies expanding and entering the US market is extremely helpful. I'm sure we'll learn more about that. And Mark, please walk us through, yourself and your background and a little bit about Sequoia and about PEO.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure to be here with you and Alex. In my role, I lead overall growth for Sequoia in the New York market. I also work as a business consultant, working directly with many of our clients on their overall HR benefits and scaling strategies. I started the New York market for Sequoia about 8.5 years ago. I've been in the space of working with scaling companies, manage their overall HR infrastructure with a heavy lean on payroll infrastructure, benefits infrastructure. I've been doing that since 2009. Been working on the as a consultant and doing business development in that space. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time as an internal HR professional in a prior career as well. So the PEO model, which is where I've really focused a lot of my energy over the last close to 15 years, is really built around supporting the infrastructure for small scaling companies, predominantly really focused on the US market. So what's really interesting is while we're focused on supporting the US market, the tool itself, which is all about providing operational efficiencies, support in compliance in HR, and buying power around healthcare specifically, which is a huge need in the US market. That program is incredibly helpful for companies as they land and expand in the US. So over the past 15 years, I've had a lot of opportunities to work with companies and help them understand the US market. So this is a tool that's really helpful for, frankly, US companies as they're scaling, where they don't have the expertise to even do this themselves when they're in this country, let alone companies that are expanding from an international market into the US market.
Great. As we all know, being in the US or experts in the US, once you get into healthcare, that even brings another level of compliance and complication. So on this panel, it's great to have this expertise. I'll quickly introduce myself, Jonathan Goldsmith. I am the GM and VP of payroll at Remote. Myself, I have over 20 years experience as an HR practitioner, and then in the product side for HR platforms, and then as a GM running the business in various organizations. So I've now been with Remote for over a year. I actually located in London, so I also have experience focusing on the EMEA market and the US market, and to discuss payroll there. So let's lead ourselves into the first poll question. And what we want to really find out from our audience is, what do you feel is your most significant knowledge gap regarding your US expansion? And there'll be 4 choices for you there. Is it compliance? Is it what employment model is the best to use? Is it the payroll challenges? Or is it all 3? So please go ahead and answer that, and we'll get into some discussion around what is the most significant knowledge gap we're finding out in the audience. As we know, all of these three issues have quite the challenge, and there are huge implications from it. So, what is some of the poll responses here? It looks like all three. We almost could have predicted that, and the lead is compliance. So that would be wonderful to lead us into. Mark, and you can discuss, I'm sorry, Alex, if you can discuss a little bit about, what to focus on in compliance in the US, the challenges that you have for all the different US states, and how someone entering that market can really feel that they can have the expertise, or how they can partner with Mosey to help them in that.
Sure. Yeah, I think compliance is a lot of things. And I think what a lot of folks on this call will find is that it's very, very complicated. So just to simplify a little bit, the way to think about this is like there's a set of rules that the business is obligated to follow, and those rules are different everywhere. So if you are in California and you have an employee there, that's going to be very different than having an employee in New York, not only at the state level, but also at the city, sometimes even the county level. That's what makes it complicated. It's literally just the rules. But at the end of the day, these are laws, so they're not optional. So it's just a question of how you do three things. One is monitor for what even is going on with your business, employees, hiring, new locations. The other one is identifying what those rules even are. I spend so much time with companies, especially ones that are operating outside the US, who are setting up their US entities, around this one phrase, I don't know what I don't know. And that's really the crux of it. And that's where expertise becomes really, really valuable, especially when you think about the speakers on this call too, the different areas that are needed in order to cover all these different areas of compliance. So that's generally how I think about it. More specifically, I would say employment is one big area. Tax is another really important area. Entity management, just compliance as a business. A lot of folks will probably be like a corporation or even a Delaware corporation that has its own set of obligations and interactions with the Secretary of State. And then, of course, there's payroll compliance too. So those are the different areas, and they unfortunately are also intermingled. Having one employee can trigger tax implications, other types of registration requirements, things like that.
Yeah, there are a ton of layers to this. And of course, 50 states, it's almost like 50 countries. And then you have all the counties within those countries. You even have city, different taxes you have to pay for city and rules there. And of course, you have the federal government. So a lot of different layers. So tell me a little bit, and the audience a little bit about, because one of the major errors you could have is maybe misclassifying workers. And I know that's a huge one that employers do when they enter the US market. Just a little bit of how you might, focus on that, support that, because that can have major implications for fines and whatnot.
Yeah, so I think classification is probably the first thing people are figuring out when they're entering the US is like, do we hire, 1099 or independent contractors or full-time employees, like W-2 employees. So there's also a lot of lingo, I think, Jonathan, which is another thing that I think people on this call should be aware of. And sometimes they're used interchangeably and sometimes they're very imprecise. So Mosey's focus is primarily on W-2 employees. And the reason why is there's just a higher level or maybe even burden of things that the employer needs to provide in order to do that in a compliant way. So that's one of the big distinctions there. There's also independent contractors, which is going to be simpler to get started, but then you run into some potential risk that you just mentioned around misclassification.
And we'll get into it a little bit later, but of course, that when those things happen, those errors happen, there are lots of implications on fines and money you'll have to pay out and things like that. So, and we know if an employee doesn't get paid correctly because of these things, then they're going to look for another role, which is a huge implication. So actually, as a company wants to be compliant, they also have to decide what is the correct business model for them when they enter the US market. So, Mark, I would love to hear a little bit about, the distinction for the PO employment model, what kind of organization it might work for, and how to best choose, how do you want to enter the market and grow your business?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So starting out, when you think about, when a company is thinking about what I would say landing, expanding in the US, the idea of what's the right model, I think is critical. And there's a few different paths that a company can go down. They can look at, we just talked about one, you go through the process of, am I going to have an entity? Am I going to have U.S. employees, or what we would call W-2 employees here in the U.S.? You can look at whether or not a contractor model makes sense, and there's a compliance aspect to that component as well. And then there's models such as the employer of record, and also the PEO model. The idea behind a PEO model, which effectively takes a lot of what Alex talked about, right? So you think about what's core within the PEO model. It's really bringing together in one partner, in one bundle, payroll administration, payroll and tax compliance, HR compliance. So if you think about local, state, federal compliance as it relates to employment labor rules, things of that nature, as well as even providing support around employment policies. If you think about just building out what's a proper parental leave policy, a paid time off policy, things of that nature, kind of all in one place. So a lot of your core HR infrastructure in one component. The other piece that Alex didn't talk about, that brings in quite a bit of both compliance as well as just like what's required in the U.S. market to be I think a successful employer, is the healthcare, is the core employee benefit offerings. And so I think most people likely on the call know this, but in the U.S. market, the healthcare system really runs through the employer. And so as companies are landing and expanding here in the U.S., understanding the needs and expectations of an employee around healthcare is critical. And the PEO model brings in like a core component of that, which is a robust benefit offering to provide to employees. So that'll cover the needs around being competitive and being able to acquire talent. But it also brings with it quite a bit of administration and compliance needs as well. So the PEO is really there to do that. And the last thing I'll just say on that component is one of the U.S. healthcare system. It's not a low cost system to be a part of. So it's a line item that needs to be considered when you're thinking about what your labor costs are here in the U.S. And you do get some relief as your company scales, although I'd still say it's going to be one of your larger line items when you think about your budgeting of salary, your cost of employment. One thing that the PEO model does for smaller companies, which is typically targeting 5 or 10 employees through a few hundred employees, is the PEO model is there to aggregate those companies together and create buying power. So it gives small companies access to more competitively priced programs that are benchmarked to the market. So effectively, if you're a larger international or European company, but you're launching a small team here in the US, you can get a level playing field against other larger employers in the US by leveraging a model like that.
So as we know in the US market, you must have these benefits to be competitive. You must provide them. So if you want to hire the best talent, you have to partner with firms that can help educate you on these things, of course, and what the potential costs may be. So Mark, actually that leads me to think about can you give me an example of how you help educate the customers that you work with, and maybe one case where a customer came in and you were able to educate them on it and help them grow their business?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think the first the way I would think about educating a company, I was literally just having this conversation with a group yesterday that's very much in this position. So Sequoia, just to be clear, we didn't cover this in the introduction, our focus is predominantly on scaling technology companies. That's sort of our specialization. So we provide the PEO platform for scaling technologies companies as a focus. But I think that this guidance would go for regardless of what maybe vertical or sub-vertical you're a part of. So part of this is, first thing is to understand what type of team are you building? So do you have a sense of the size of the team, right? At launch, and then as far visibility as you can look out to, if you would say like over the first 12 to 24 months, am I going to have a team of 5, or am I dropping a team of 5 and growing a team of 35? So because understanding the size of a team will help you to start to narrow down, do we need to or want to invest in a more comprehensive platform like a PEO, Or do we just need a basic payroll platform to support a couple of employees, or somewhere in between where the employer of record model potentially could come into play as well? So there's some considerations as to the size of the team at launch and as you scale. The PEO model is likely to be a strong fit for a team that's going to scale. I would typically say, scaling to at least 10 employees within a reasonable amount of time within the first 12 months. And if there's scale beyond that, there's likely a need for a broader infrastructure and support level that a PEO can bring into the mix. So one is understanding the team size. The other piece that you want to be thinking about is like industry wise, like where are you playing and where are you going to be recruiting talent from? Like how are you going to acquire the talent? Where are they coming from? So, in the vertical, the broad vertical that we service predominantly, which is scaling technology companies, it's really helpful for those companies to understand what the talent market looks like. What are the expectations around benefits? So I think we can all basically align on the fact that having healthcare and a core benefit offering is critical as a U.S. employer. What that program looks like, how much you have to invest in that, will vary depending on the vertical that you are a part of, right? So if you're in the venture-backed tech space, the expectations around the quality of those programs, the comprehensiveness of those programs might look a little bit different than if you're in a, more of a blue-gray collar type vertical or something along those lines. So understanding that market, I think, is really important. From our perspective, we will help our clients by leveraging benchmarking data across the technology market so they understand what does competitive look like, what kind of programs do you need to have in place, how much should you be investing, what's a typical cost to participate in a program like that for an employee, so that they can put in an infrastructure that's financially efficient, scalable, and will really help them attract and retain talent.
Excellent, excellent. So a lot there. You guide a lot, you help a lot, you guide them on how to grow their business, what are their focuses and what vertical they're on, and that will kind of dictate a little bit which avenue they go. So this actually leads us into the second poll question that we want to ask. Now that we've learned a little bit about PEO here, what aspect of PEO services interests you the most? The 4 choices we're looking at right now are HR and payroll management, compliance support, employee benefits administration, or risk mitigation. So all big 4 all these are important, but what interests you the most to educate yourself and for a PEO service? Of course, we didn't really discuss, actually, there's the part about retirement plans, right? Those are another area that are very important for the US market to be successful. And maybe we talk about it later, but it's looked at from each company, each employer, employee, they want this in addition to health benefits expected, very different than EMEA. So let's see how our poll came back and what those percentages were. Looks like compliance support was almost half of our pollees answered. HR and payroll management at 26%, risk mitigation just slightly behind, employee benefits administration. So very interesting there. So actually, this is a great lead in back to Alex to talk about a little bit about that compliance support. What I'd love to know is, because there are so many layers of compliance in the US, and you mentioned them a little bit before, give me a little bit about how you handhold these customers that come in and make something that can be so complicated a little bit simpler, and you educate them on that.
Yeah, I think that's the key to this whole thing working. So we talked about the PEO model. There's also people using payroll services directly and having to do more of the compliance lift in-house. As companies grow, that will start to happen more. And so what we find on Mosey, it's very, very complicated. I would say even the experts are not experts in every single state, every single city, every single county. So this creates an enormous burden for some of this expertise. So to make it really powerful, you have to make it simple. So one of the core design principles around Mosey is to design for non-experts. And we don't mean that in the case of like, Yes, there are lawyers and accountants and tax people who use Mosey. That's not to say that they're not experts. What we're saying is that it's so complicated because the rules are different everywhere and they are constantly changing. So I think that's a really important part of that. The other one is building systems. So what I like to talk to people about when they're bringing up, like, here are my concerns about compliance, here are some of the situations we had. We got some penalties, we got some nasty letters from some state agencies and local agencies, is to think about this as the collection of rules and putting in place a couple of systems to help you stay on top of it. I think nobody likes that feeling of falling behind or anything like that. So having this in a good place is super important. And it's actually much, much, much easier to handle compliance when you're starting from a clean slate. It's actually very difficult when you're constantly cleaning things up. And so there's a lot of strategies I think people have, but just keep in mind, if you ignore this problem for a really long time, it's actually harder, it's more expensive to clean up later. So when it comes to building tooling around this, think about just checking the rules anytime something has changed about the business. An employee has been hired, they've relocated, some other aspect of your business has changed, like you now have a physical location or you have services that pull you into scope of other locations. You basically have to recheck that every single time against all the rules that could be applicable. So that's really the first challenge, is building up those systems to do it. Obviously, Mosey, we have automated systems that allow you to do that. So you can get alerted rather than figuring it out yourself. Mosey can push that to you, and we have a lot of automation and guidance built in.
That's actually, you made a great point at the beginning, and it made me think about my focus on payroll and designing payroll for non-payroll people, right? So, thinking about how do we take things that are complicated and have depth and bring in systems, so product, process, or people to really help make it easier for our customers. And actually, I know you've also, I believe you've been talking about your API for state compliance with some of your partners, and that kind of goes along with what you just spoke about. Making sure we can't put our head in the sand, right? The proverbial head in the sand, and not really handle some of these issues that change. And even little nuances from state to state. If someone moves to a different state, things completely change. So maybe a little bit about how you focused on this as a product part and to help you and help your customers into keeping up with that and the updates that are coming out all along the year for all these areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly moving. And so I think one thing that's important to understand about this problem too, there's really two buckets of what happens. There's like setting up, which is like you're entering a new location, you got to open up a bunch of accounts, and then there's ongoing compliance. But what you'll find in the US market is there's gates where compliance gets enforced in different ways. One of those moments will happen when you're getting that new hire on payroll for the first time. And in order to process payroll, you have to have a tax account open with this particular state agency, an unemployment insurance account open, a UI tax rate, things like that, which are going to be needed in order to go process payroll. So those are just natural gates, but there are others too. So if you are not on a PEO model and you're setting up health insurance directly, say through a different carrier or something like that, in California, you have to be registered with the Secretary of State to get health insurance. And so that's another gate where you now have to figure out and interact with these different rules. So I think putting those together, you have that initial setup, which you have to get right, that is enforced in some form or another. And then you have all this ongoing compliance. And so when you think about the ongoing compliance part of it, the way that Mosey sees it, it's a constantly moving picture. There's new legislation that's coming out all the time. The number one blog posts on Mosey's website right now are all to do with these new rules around remote reimbursement policies, electronic monitoring notices, new kinds of paid family medical leave programs that are now required or mandatory. So this stuff just constantly changes. And then there's a lot of administration with just managing accounts. We love snail mail in the United States. I don't know why, but it's often the only way you'll hear about certain problems, penalties, changes to your account, and they require some maintenance.
Yeah, and it's really important for all three of our companies and organizations to make sure we're keeping up with these changes, because you have, like the IRS and other areas that when they do enforce something or we're not compliant, it's pretty significant. For example, in the US, quarter of all workers deal with payroll errors. We need to keep up with what's going on. Not to scare everybody, but the IRS collects nearly $7 billion in penalties a year. So, and we know that if you don't you're not aware of the issue, or they find it, then there's fines and there's late fees and all of these things. So it's important to partner with organizations like ours, where we really have a focus on compliance and understanding new rules and regulations and laws. So I think that kind of brings us into our next poll question a little bit, and about compliance. And so, what does the audience think is the most critical compliance issue that can derail a company's expansion? So we have 4 choices for you there. It's failing to comply with state wage and hour laws, incorrectly classifying employees and contractors, overlooking state-specific licensing and permitting requirements, and non-compliance with state tax obligations. And Mark, I think it'd be lovely to talk to you a little bit about, after this and we get the results, that part about the classifying employees and contractors and the model and how it may guide you in classifying those, and how you support and what the nuanced difference is. So what is some of the results of our poll? So it looks like non-compliance with state tax obligations was the leader here, but 2 very close, exact same percentages for overlooking the state-specific licensing and permitting, and incorrectly classifying employees and contractors. So, Mark, I'd love to know about understanding the PEO model a little bit more in depth, and how do you decide the type of employee you want to hire in the U.S. as you go, and start planning your expansion, your entry, and how would you guide an organization on that, and who they should or should not hire?
Yeah, so it's a huge area of focus for companies with employees in the U.S. It's probably one of the top areas that employers will be audited and find themselves in trouble, is misclassification of a W-2 employee versus a 1099 employee. And there are very specific rules and tests that any employer can go through to determine whether somebody is or should be viewed as a 1099 or treated as a 1099 versus a W-2. And I think it's important to start with well, what does that mean for the company, right? So effectively, as a 1099 or a contractor, you're basically paying an invoice. I mean, what you're basically saying is, this person doesn't work for me. They're a freelancer. They do their own work. You're not in control of their sort of everyday actions. They're not really using your company's assets. There's a number of tests from the IRS. So it's actually pretty clearly laid out. So from our perspective, and this will be the case for most, for the PEO model overall, the PEO will not make that determination. That's actually really critical, that the company, it's the company's obligation, or in this case, our client's obligation, to make that determination. If they have questions about whether somebody is or is not a 1099 or a W-2, we'll help them work through that. But we're really going to rely on them to make a judgment using the baseline, the baseline test from the IRS as to what is considered a 1099 versus a W-2. Ultimately, the 1099, if you're treating somebody as a 1099, all this conversation we just had about being a competitive employer, the benefits side of things, providing for the employee. I mean, it's an arm's length relationship. You are not, as a 1099, you are not providing any benefits typically. You're not handling the payroll taxes. I mean, they are not an employee of yours. So a lot of what we've talked about here today, and Alex, I'm curious on your perspective on this, but I mean, there's no longer an employer-employee relationship. I mean, so your obligations are a lot less on the 1099 side. If somebody's a 1099, I think the challenge is companies may lean towards a 1099 when somebody is a W-2 employee, and that can trip up the system and cause audits or ultimately fines if you're misclassifying employees.
So Alex, thoughts on, as a company starts to think about this, how they want to expand, and obviously each class of these employees are going to have different compliance you have to worry about. And so the differentiation between those, I don't know if there's one that necessarily is easier than the other. Possibly, if a company wants to start, efficiently or more easily to enter the market? Would you have a suggestion there, or is it really you come in with what your idea of expansion is or what business you're in, and Mosey can help guide sort of this is what you're looking at in the future?
Yeah, I think I would start with top talent wants to be an employee, not necessarily a contractor. So it does come back down to this talent question of like, what are your goals for this US expansion? Obviously, talent is one big aspect. There might be some other business implications that you're also trying to solve for, which we can also talk about. But just purely on the contractor versus a full-time employee, I think that is a really big distinction. And thinking about how long-term that relationship is, it's really easy to go bootstrap the US presence by hiring a bunch of contractors in the US. But just keeping in mind, right, the longevity of that relationship, right, the longer that you're going, the more misclassification risk you have, and also just keeping in mind the top talent do want to be employees, and with that comes additional responsibility, additional types of benefits, and things like that. So that's really how I think about it for purely from a business perspective when trying to answer that question.
And actually, that makes me think about, sorry, Mark, a little bit about, because I'm located in EMEA, and when you have an employee and the flexibility of it's not working out, and what a little bit about the compliance of onboarding, offboarding those employees, and what flexibility you might have, because in EMEA it can be more restrictive.
Yeah, the US, I think it's going to vary by state. I think that's going to be basically a common answer across any question that we get asked here. But generally speaking, when we think about new hire onboarding requirements, and then there are termination requirements. So when we think about this for Mosey, the reason why we have to monitor changes in payroll so closely is because these are events that are very important. So when you're hiring someone for the first time, there's typically things you need to provide to them. Sometimes it's information, sometimes it's notifications. Labor law posters is another one. So there's many things that you might need to provide during that time period. And working with your payroll provider or PEO, oftentimes they will file the mandatory new hire filing requirement, which is just to notify the state agencies of a new hire there. And then there's also these termination and offboarding requirements, which can be very, very strict. So in California, things like paying out on the final day of work, the final paycheck, as well as things like unused vacation time. Those are very, very strict. They're very clear, but you have to know to do them oftentimes. And this involves both an HR process as well as a payroll process. And you want to make sure you have systems to make sure that you're following the right rules at the right time.
Yeah, I think that leads into Mark a little bit if he wants to speak to how you help with that support, or what, part of your organization, and guide on all of those little pieces. Because I think coming over from, like I said, from Europe, each country has a different process and different rules around that. So how would that work for the PEO model?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of what Alex is talking about. So within the PEO model, there are rules at the local, state, federal level as to how you, like, what you collect from an employee when you're bringing them on board, from a tax perspective, from an employment verification perspective. And then there are rules when somebody exits, as relates to, it's a good example, like a California employee, where there needs to be payment made, final payment made on last day of work, things of that nature. So there's a lot of nuances as it relates to that. I mean, I think where we will get involved on the PEO side is also helping companies think through properly managing a tricky employment situation, right? So if you're talking about exiting an employee, and I think this is a little bit different than if you're in, a country in Europe or Asia, around the world. It may not be as straight, as laid out as like the work councils or things of that nature, but like you do want to manage the exit of an employee properly to avoid like legal implications. I mean, ultimately, the U.S. is an employment at will relationship, right? So, effectively, a company can let go of an employee at any time for any reason. But, in reality, there's a lot of legalities that come with this. And, there's employment practices liability. So employers getting sued for wrongful termination and things of that nature is very, very real here in the U.S. as well. So making sure you're handling exits in a way that is thoughtful and, effectively covers the organization, like having documented things properly, is something that will help quite a bit with.
That's good. So I'm going to turn it around here a little bit and add a little bit of payroll component here because it really aligns with both of you and your businesses very much, depending upon how much, the payroll intricacies here. Um, I think we've talked about, obviously, we want to make sure we're compliant and we're doing the accurate things around payroll. I think, thinking about the most common payroll mistakes that happen in the US market. And I think one of the important things I'd like everybody to think about is that first paycheck, and making sure you pay accurately and you get that first paycheck out. Because actually, if you miss the first paycheck, because a lot of employees are paycheck to paycheck in the U.S., 25% of employees will start looking for a new job if you would all mess up that first pay slip. And we talked about finding top talent. You do all that work, and then you need to be partnering with the right organizations to make sure that first paycheck is accurate, compliant, and doing the right things. And then if you happen to get so bad that with your partners that you miss the second paycheck, now you're at over 50% are looking for a new role. So being compliant, making sure we're accurate, making sure we get those paychecks out accurately is very important, because workers are very, very affected by any mistakes in that paycheck, because some of the nature of the U.S. economy and the market and living paycheck to paycheck. So that's important. But we find that, like I mentioned before, 25% of all workers dealing with payroll errors. So you can see how this is a pretty significant issue that we really want to partner with folks that are keeping compliant. It's not just how you start, it's how it's ongoing too, and making sure you have products that can scale and are efficient at that. So I think payroll is a big underpinning of helping with that and supporting, make sure we're paying compliantly and accurately. And so that's one of my biggest thoughts on pitfalls. Of course, deducting the wrong amounts for benefits and other deductions can really affect someone's pay slip. And again, little changes in that, little underpaying, overpaying, can be quite significant for individuals. So that actually brings us into our next next poll question, which has to do with payroll. How does your company stay updated on payroll laws and regulations? So do you use regular training sessions, consult with payroll experts, subscribe to payroll compliance updates, or use automated payroll software? I think everybody should do all of these, quite frankly. It's better to be redundant with some of these things. But we all do it differently. And of course, coming into the US market, you might ask, well, payroll experts I need for all 50 states or cities or things like that. And that's why it's good partnering here. So far, what's our poll response here? Well, it looks like consulting with payroll experts is number 2, using automated payroll software. So it's really people and product there that are the most significant. Regular training sessions, no response to, which is interesting to me. But I think the expectation is if I'm buying a platform and having the experts, that should really be where that expertise comes from. So I think it's interesting to think about this, that there are experts coming from all of our organizations and really supporting them. Payroll experts are good in some areas, but having Mosey and having Sequoia One really answer some of the questions that can get a little bit more detailed here and help you in those areas. So I think that just leads us into best practices, strategic insights for an organization. We've talked about a little bit about entering the market, a little bit about how you stay effective in the market, compliant in the market. What is the best way to really partner with your organizations, bring the expertise in, make sure, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you found when companies show up and say, I want to enter the US market? I already know this, or I already have an idea. I'll start with Mark, you. Where do you see the biggest mistakes that these new companies come in with?
Yeah, and I think you've probably heard from some of my talk track. I do think companies coming into the US, compliance at a local, state, federal level overall is a bear, right? So and we've talked about it from a payroll is core, right? But that quickly moves over into your actual employment relationship with the employee, like how you manage that, and then delivering the healthcare and benefits program as well, which has a whole additional set of both compliance factors, and then there's the competitive landscape that goes along with that as well. So I think understanding all of those together, and the complexity there, I think, is probably underestimated when companies are coming into the US. One other thing I was just thinking about when we were thinking about the last poll, the combination of both software and expertise to support payroll. The other piece of this is really making sure you've got sound policies for your US employees. So you can have a great software platform, but if an employee moves to another location and doesn't let you know, or does not put that into, and oftentimes in a remote environment, especially for international companies landing in the US, but we're much more remote now than we were pre-COVID. That can create tremendous compliance issues for an employer if an employee moves and does not let you know that they've moved and has not input that into your system, and your system is not connected to like your back end tax liabilities, or with a company like Mosey, at the end of the year, an employee wants to file their taxes at a local or state level. If you have not been registered properly, or you didn't know where that employee was, that could create a major issue. And we've seen that with our own clients. We've seen it with many companies, and that we've also seen that with people where the U.S. employees were working internationally and maybe not letting their employers know, or they didn't have a sound policy around that to help guide that so that they can stay compliant both in the U.S. and internationally as well.
That's a great point, because as someone that lived in the U.S. and then would come work in the U.K., in theory, if I'm there for a certain amount of time, I can't be working unless we're going to report it to the government here about the actual salary I made that I was in the UK during that. So Alex, that actually brings us into, and if you could quickly answer, I would say from one angle is, what are the biggest mistakes these companies make when they come in, and then what would work well for them? What's the strategy you would suggest in a few lines about their thought process when they come into the market?
Yeah, so I think the most common pitfall is just waiting too long to go get these things in place. So it actually starts from the moment of incorporation, really, where you're setting up that US subsidiary and making sure you've gotten that sorted out. That will have a lot of downstream impact on just about everything. So starting from strong foundations is really, really important. I'll give you a very practical example. Imagine something goes wrong and you need to get on a call with a state agency in like New York. Mosey works with companies like in Australia that have a US subsidiary. There's no way that they're going to be able to manage that and call someone in the middle of the night to try and do that. So there's just some practical things that are important there. It just makes it more difficult to clean up if you don't have strong foundations. So that's probably the biggest thing there, which is also the strategy that I would definitely recommend, which is the further away it is, I think the more you should be leaning on experts and tooling. I think that the tooling here in the US is actually quite good. And I think it is important that these businesses offload more of this than they're thinking right now, because it's ultimately going to save a lot of distraction and potential issues as you're getting that US presence established.
Yeah, and I think it's also important because a lot of workers in the US are paid weekly or biweekly. And if payroll goes out on a Friday and there's any mistakes or you're not compliant and there's issues, that means they're not getting paid over a weekend. And they're not going to get paid till potentially the following end of the week. So being compliant and being accurate is important here. So to sum up, to get to our Q&A questions, I want to get it. But the last thing, if you were to give me that one 30,000 foot line, what you would say they're starting, what's the number one thing you want them to come prepared with and remember when they're growing? And go ahead, Mark, start with you.
Yeah, I would say understanding what type of team you're building, where you plan on building that team is really key, because that really will that'll set the plan in place in terms of what type of infrastructure you need, what type of benefit program you need, and also start to help you model through, do I need a PEO? Is that appropriate? Should I be considering an EOR model? Should I be thinking about basic payroll, or, the 1099 model?
Great. And Alex, your line there, your 30,000 foot, come prepared with this or think about this.
I think there's compliance is complicated. There's a lot of rules. We're talking so much about all these little nuances and everything, but if you just take a step back, it's literally just following the rules. So think about that as like building the systems, the processes, the tooling, and working with people that get you the ability to follow those rules with as little effort as possible is so worth it. And then the last one is just like, this is also a business decision at the end of the day. And some of what's driving this really should find its way through every decision that's being made, right? If this is opening up a new market, the US is the largest market for most things, like use that to drive those decisions. Speed, expertise, what are the risks, everything like that. Really staying focused on that will keep it will be efficient for you as an organization.
And I think for me to think about payroll, actually, I find that I want, prospect or customers to come with understanding the full compensation you're offering here, the full benefit packages. So you can understand, payroll or the costs of paying employees are going to be pretty comprehensive here. Benefits don't come along with our taxes for the most part here, unlike in the European model. So understanding your costs and entering that, I think, is important as we start discussions and roll out your payroll. So that actually rolls us into our final poll question before we get to our Q&A. And what the folks in the audience would like to have around a demo of any of our services, and our choices, of course, here are Sequoia One, Mozy, and Remote. And of course, you can choose one or many here, as we all are great partners and work together. I'll give it a few seconds there because we have a lot of questions and a lot of great answers that will come out of those questions. So what's the result of our poll so far? It's coming along there. I'm guessing maybe they all apply. I'm not sure there. But we'll get those numbers and we'll definitely follow up with those demo requests. And so now we're going to head into the Q&A session. If we don't answer any questions here, we're going to follow up with you after the event. And please type in the chat, head over to the Q&A tab, and you can ask your questions. So first question here, who should be responsible to ensure employees are correctly classified? HR or payroll? Mark, Alex, feel free. Whoever like to answer that.
My take on it would be it's kind of an HR thing. It has to do with hiring practices. I think payroll is a little more of the implementation of the decision that's already been made about what kind of worker this is and the policies that should determine it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from a payroll perspective, I would definitely say HR. But Mark, please, you were going to say.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that sits more so in HR, probably straddles legal more so than payroll.
Great. Question number 2. Well, I can, there we go. What questions should companies be asking themselves before deciding to expand it to the US? So I think we got maybe the one top question, but let's go from the top question that I asked you to say, but maybe what's the number 2 question? What should you ask yourself as a company? This I need to be aware of if I really want to expand it to US. Mark?
Well, I think understand, you're probably getting this from me. I'm leaning like talent focused. What type of employees are you going to need? So if you're expanding in the US, what functions are you going to need to build? Where are you, I'm focused really on what functions, where are these people going to be working from? So are you going to have an office? Are you going to be remote? A lot of, understanding of what type of team you're going to be building will then again, lead into what type of infrastructure you need. So I would really be focused on what type of team, what type of talent, where is that talent, size of the team.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're going to invest in the US market, you want to come in and think about, why am I entering this market? What am I trying to get out of it? And what is the team around that I need to be effective and successful and get the best performance out of to, ultimately grow my business in the US. So third poll question: how can companies prepare for cultural differences and ensure a smooth transition for their teams? So, Alex, some thoughts around there. Maybe you've experienced that in your company. If you've hired, and some suggestions there, and the
Yeah,
cultural difference
absolutely.
between US and other countries.
So I experienced this a ton, and also just having worked with so many founders from all over the world that are, getting started in the U.S. I do think there's a couple of things that are going to be a little bit more jarring, but one would be just the nomenclature, just the terms that are used in the U.S. Might be different from what you're used to, and there's things that have legal implications, and there are things that don't. So when we're talking about employees, 1099, W-2, those are all examples where you need to understand the context in which these questions are being asked, because there might be implications. I think the other one on the more cultural side of things too is like, I don't know, I was born and raised in New York. I don't think New York is well known for its patience. And so when you are going about this, you're going to be interacting with many different agencies and people along the way. And so I think that is something to keep in mind as you're setting up ways that you might need to communicate with somebody or call a state agency to go resolve an issue, is just to be prepared for that. I think all these people are very lovely. I've never had an issue personally. But I think that's something to be at least prepared for. One way to do that is just try to understand as much as you can upfront. Otherwise, it's very difficult sometimes to route you. And I think that's often where people get stuck on hold for like hours, or they're just reading through these terrible state websites trying to figure out what's going on. So there's a little bit you can do to prepare will actually go a long way in dealing with some of those differences.
Yeah, I think a good guidance here is, I've now been in the UK for 8 years and been working with European companies for over 12. And to remember that in Europe, you have all the different countries and all the different cultures in those countries. In the US, it's not just one US. There are regions of the US, and there are different cultural differences. States can be different. So I think taking that mindset into it and understanding that, each region, the Northeast, or, even from New York to Boston, can be very different. And just maybe learning and doing some of those things that we've learned to do through COVID and other areas about flexible working and how do you interact a team is super important. How do you get your DNA, your culture, and connect those two and make a nice bridge between that?
And Jonathan, one thing I would add to that, or build on that, is there are nuances to even things like compensation expectations, compensation structures, even types of benefit programs that will work well in different locations, or so even the insurance industry tends to be state by state as well. So sort of understanding that, having employees in different states will mean different things when you think about your overall comp philosophy and your investment in people.
I think that's a great piece of information, because it also, payroll can help guide a bit on the different compensation that might be expected in different regions, depending on the high cost locations, the verticals you're going to go into, the talent you're going to be recruiting. So there's a lot of differences between those regions and expectations now. And also, where are you going to find that talent? Again, we go back to what we talked about before, is different verticals can have a lot of talent in certain areas of the country. So it's important to be guided through the different partners here on those items. We have time for a couple more poll questions. Is having 5 employees a minimum legal requirement for POs or a target threshold? And second follow-up, is it possible to use a PO and select local healthcare companies specific to employee regions rather than large national providers? So Mark, I'll have you answer that one, please.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Question 1, there's no legal requirement. I would say the considerations for a company um, and the size of maybe being less than 5 employees is the financial investment you make in the PEO and maybe the comprehensiveness of that platform and service. There are certain PEOs that do have minimum employee requirements. So typically, if a PEO does have a requirement and that's their own business model decision, not necessarily a legal requirement, but oftentimes we will see 5 being sort of the cutoff point of where a PEO will engage. I can tell you for Sequoia, we can and do work with, and we've worked with many companies internationally and have stood up the PEO platform at their first 1 or 2 employees, or we've even stood up the platform in anticipation of hiring the first employee. But we would typically guide a company to do that only if they have visibility to get to 5+ employees at least. Otherwise, there's probably some more financially efficient models to consider. So it's not a legal requirement. This is more about the needs and trajectory of the company, and that's landing here, as well as the PEO that they're speaking with.
Great. I know I've learned a lot about PEOs here today, so this has been very helpful. So just to sort of wrap up here in about 90 seconds or so, Alex, I'll start with you. In your personal opinion, what's the single most important factor to be successful when entering the U.S. market? And if you have a short success story, that can show that a company effectively was, navigating the market and was successful.
Sure. So I think number one, just preparation. So I think the fact that everybody who's on the call today is already showing that you're above and beyond a lot of others. So I think preparation is really important. Just knowing the keywords to follow along. So as you're doing this, you can make informed decisions, I think is super important there. And then, when it comes to using Mozy's worked with a lot of different companies in many different industries. And the folks that are using Mozy successfully outside the US for their US subsidiary, it's a pretty common use case there where they're using us to help inform what are the things that need to happen, build the systems, the monitoring, and then handle things like physical mail, getting the alerts and everything. So it all flows through one system just because it's so much harder to manage abroad. So that's how we see people using that. And then we've had companies who, have a franchising business that they're opening up franchises all throughout the United States. It didn't start in the US, but they're opening up new locations all the time. Very mixed bag of different types of compliance requirements as a business as well as employment. And so that's how you can use Mozy to make sure you're powering that US expansion.
Very helpful. And Mark, same question, what's that number one success, to have success, what's the number one factor? And also maybe a little story about a company you found be most effective when they've navigated the market.
Yeah, I would say the number one factor is understanding the talent landscape. So we spent a lot of time talking about compliance, and so which is critical. You need infrastructure to land, expand, and scale. And we're talking a lot about how do you avoid getting in trouble in a lot of ways, which is absolutely critical. But if you think about success, you really have to understand the talent market that you're going into as well, and that brings in the compensation landscape, the overall talent landscape. So that's really critical. And the other piece is putting in a program that's going to be scalable for you. So understanding the local market so that you don't overinvest in benefits or underinvest in benefits. So putting in something in place that's rooted in data, rooted in benchmarking, so that you can build for scale.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for your time today. Very insightful. For me, I'm sure for the audience, I want to thank everybody that's joined the webinar and all of Mozy and Sequoia One and Remote. And we'll be following up with everybody that attended, that's requested a demo. And thank you, everybody, for the time. Mark, Alex, it's been wonderful.
Thank you. And thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Alex. Thanks all.